from stories that we're not even sure if it's correct or not.
Right, right. They quote from sources that are not biblical, not canonical, and even mistakes in those sources are brought into the Quran and commentary by the redactors. Yeah.
Yes, and think about it. Why do Muslims quote all of these unreliable sources from centuries after the life of Jesus when we have sources that were written within the lifetimes of Jesus' followers?
Right.
You know why I think it is? Because Muslims don't have any early sources, so they're used to using sources that are 200 or 300 years after the events. Think about it. Muslims, what are your sources on the life of Muhammad? What sources do you have that are written on the life of Muhammad? What's your most trusted collection? Sahih al-Bukhari, written what? Written more than 2 centuries after the lifetime of Muhammad. And so it makes perfect sense to Muslims to go to our sources and to pull up a source that came from 2 centuries or 3 centuries after the events, because that's what they have to do. Christians, aren't you glad that all of the sources we use on the life of Jesus were written within a century?
Yeah.
Were written within about 60 years of the life of Jesus. Guess what? Muslims don't have anything that early on the life of Muhammad. And they criticize us for not knowing about Jesus when their sources are much, much later than the sources that we use.
And what about our friend Manu and others who want to just hold on to the Quran? You got no sources at all. You know, even Maududi, the Salafi Pakistani, really, who is very strict, was very strict, he's dead now, but in Islam, he made comments that I understand were in the Yusuf Ali commentary, and they took it out because it was too embarrassing, to the effect that, this is a paraphrase, that without the hadith, the Quran makes no sense.
That's absolutely correct.
And that, you know, there's no chronology, certain issues start and spring up for no apparent reason. And he was, you know, a radical Muslim. Yeah. And we got people like Manu saying, oh, we're just going to believe in the Quran. We got no traditions whatsoever.
Let's face it, if we're honest, now I understand if you've been raised all your life to believe that the Quran is this masterpiece, you tend to believe what you're taught. But anyone who comes to the Quran from outside, this book is a mess. It makes no sense. It's jumbled together. It's tossed together. Interestingly, in the 20th century, one of the greatest atheist philosophers of the 20th century was a man named Antony Flew. My field is philosophy, so he's a philosopher. So I study Antony Flew. But Antony Flew was asked a question about Christianity and Islam and what he thought about them and so on. And he made an interesting comment. He said that the Bible is a magnificent work of literature, no matter your background. He said an atheist can read the Bible and it's very interesting. And then he said, to read the Quran is to do penance. Penance is where you punish yourself because of your sins. He said that, and this is not a Christian saying. This is an atheist saying, talking about the Quran. But you know, we sort of steered off course here.
Yeah.
But bringing it back, that brother pointed out 2 things. One, he said suicide bombers, the people blowing up places and blowing up buses and blowing themselves up, and women blowing themselves up, and men blowing themselves up. They're Muslims. Right. They're Muslims. And I mean, think about the situations. How many people have been caught over the past few years doing horrible things? Remember the woman who was caught, and she would actually find a young Muslim woman, have that woman raped, and then tell her that the only way she can end the disgrace, I don't know how it would be a disgrace for that person to be raped, she didn't do anything, but the Muslims put all this pressure on her and say, you've been disgraced, you've been dishonored, and the only way to restore your honor is to go and blow up these Jews. That's the only way you can do it. This is what Muslims do, and you almost never find Muslims complaining about it.
No.
You have, I mean, think about this.
They aren't true Muslims. All those people who commit they're not real Muslims.
Yeah, but think about this. If Christians were doing this, if I found out that Christians were having other Christians raped and then convincing those raped Christians to go and blow people up in the name of Christianity, I would be going berserk. I would be out of my mind. And Muslims, it doesn't matter. As long as they're blowing up Jews, who cares if you're raping Muslims and sending them to die in suicide bombings? As long as you're blowing up the Jews, that's fine. And brother pointed out another point, that if you go and blow up and kill a bunch of people, you're a martyr. You're a martyr in Islam. You're a wonderful person. Right. If you die in the name of Judaism or something like that, you're a horrible person. Let's just drag your body through the streets.
Yeah. I mean, can you look at this? Listen, by the way, thank you, brother. Are you still with us?
Yes.
I'm sorry. You go ahead. If you have a final point to make, you go ahead and make it before we go to the next caller. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Just the final thing is that we depend on actually things that it's even before 60 years before Jesus. Like we have Yusuf who wrote lived through the time of Jesus. He was not after Jesus. He lived through the time of Jesus, and we have all the work of Eusebius to date.
Yeah.
So we have firsthand. We don't have things like even 30, 40. As we know that even the Bible for St. Matthew was written in the year 46 and 60. Again, was translated by St. Matthew himself
Yeah.
to Greek. So we have firsthand and people who lived with Jesus. So when you bend on things like it's really very reliable. So thanks for Brother David.
Yes, absolutely, brother. And think about this, because we know that Muslims have no clue what they're talking about when they talk about the Bible.
No.
They have absolutely no clue. Because why? Because their imams lie to them.
It's been corrupted. You ask them when, by who, and they never can answer.
They have no clue. They just hear all their lives that it's been corrupted. It never occurs to them to actually go out and study it. If they do study it, they go to a bad Muslim website, which has all sorts of nonsense on it. But just think about this. Every book of this New Testament, every book in the New Testament was written within about 60, 65 years after the time of Jesus. Everything in there was written within the lifetime of eyewitnesses. Some scholars will tell you every single book of the New Testament was written within about 40 years. Was written within about 40 years of the life of Jesus. So all of our sources, all of our historical sources on the life of Jesus are much, much earlier than your earliest source on the life of Muhammad. Your earliest detailed source on the life of Muhammad is Ibn Ishaq. Muslims reject it and say, oh, you can't even trust Ibn Ishaq, and it was written more than a century after the lifetime of Muhammad. So your earliest source is written more than a century after Muhammad. You don't even believe it. The most common source that you appeal to, Sahih al-Bukhari, was written more than 2 centuries after the events, and you criticize our knowledge of Jesus? When your best source is much later than any source we use? It would never occur to me as a Christian to say, I'm going to use this source written in the 3rd century about Jesus. I would say, no, of course not. Of course I'm not going to do that. These were books written within the lifetimes of the eyewitnesses, and you Muslims, what do you appeal to when it comes to the lifetime of Muhammad? It's in the hadith, and it's, I got this story from so-and-so, who got it 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 from his grandfather, who heard it from Muhammad. Horrible! Horrible! And that's the best you've got, my friends.
Excellent, excellent. Well, I think we have one more caller before the break, and I want to talk some more on what you just said. We could talk about that all night. That's a show in itself. But let's see if we can get this caller before the next break. Welcome, you're on the air with Jesus or Muhammad. Hello, you're on the air.
Joseph, David, how you doing, guys?
Okay, how you doing?
Good. As you know, I'm not a perfect English speaker as you guys, but anyway, I have a master's degree in Arabic language.
Okay.
So anyway, I've been reading in the Bible for a while ago, and I try to study it very carefully. And really, and unfortunately, you guys talking about histories and all this kind of stuff, but I find most book in the whole planet talk about hatred and all the bad stuff and adultery and all this kind of stuff, the Holy Bible, the one you have in your hand. And I have at least about 50 ayah that spread hatred, and I could prove it to you from your own source.
Okay, so can you give us, so you're telling us that the Bible is filled with hatred. You've got more than 50 verses from the Bible that talk about hatred.
Yes.
Okay, all right. Now, let's start something. Now, you say you've been reading the Bible for a long time, and so
not for a long time. About 2 months now.
For 2 months?
Yes.
Oh, well, then you're not familiar with the structure of the Bible. Then let me educate you real briefly. Wait a minute. Listen. You need some education, sir. If you've only been reading the Bible for 2 months, I've been reading it for 20 years. Now, look, there's a New Testament, Ahad al-Jadid, and there's an Old Testament, Ahad al-Qadim.
That's what I have.
Okay, now stop. Now, you understand that for Christians like David and myself, the Old Testament is true. The New Testament is true, but the New Testament is our perfect rule of faith and practice for today. We're not Jews living in Israel 2,600 years ago. So, we ask you, bring forth one verse, sir, one verse from the New Testament. You said you got 50. Yes. You said you got 50. Surely you've got at least one good verse from the New Testament, if you've got 50, that proves that Christianity teaches hatred. Go ahead and give it to us.
Yes, and even this verse is called you are the people of adultery. You know, you are the kids of adultery. I cannot believe the
Okay, we're waiting.